Hi, I'm Christina Camelli. I am in love with patchwork made with wedge shapes, and today I want to show you how to make a magic triangle block using a wedge ruler. In addition to your regular quilting tools, you'll need a 10-degree wedge ruler. This is the one I'm using, but there's many out there. And on mine, I've put a couple of pieces of masking tape. The tape is going to give me a little bit of grip when I go to cut my fabric into a wedge shape and keep it from slipping around. So to start off, what you're going to need is several strips of fabric in 9-inch widths in all the colors that you want to use. And when you're ready to start cutting your fabric, the first thing you'll need to do is get your first angle on your strip of fabric. So I use my ruler to do that. There's this nice center line running down the middle of the ruler, and what I do is line that up with the folded edge of the fabric. And then I can make my first angled cut. And so now there's that first angle, and I'm going to use that as I line up the wedge ruler again. Now, when we're working with wedges, we want to focus on the wide end of the wedge when we're doing things like cutting or sewing together. That's going to keep the wider, bigger edge of the wedge piece, whatever you're putting together, consistent, and it's going to move any inconsistencies down to the narrow end of the wedge piece, where they'll be smaller proportionally because we're dealing with a smaller piece of fabric, and maybe they won't need to be fixed at all. They'll be so small. So here, when I'm talking about lining up the wide edge, what I'm using is the 11 3/4 inch mark. So I'm going to align that with the raw edge of my fabric, and then make sure that the rest of the this side of the ruler is lined up with the cut that I just made. And when I make these cuts, I try to keep a couple of fingers on the ruler and a couple of fingers off to keep it from sliding around. And then flip the wedge ruler around and do the same thing the other way, lining up the wide end first, and don't worry about too much about what's happening at the narrow end. So maybe I made a little cutting error here and the edge of my fabric is peeking out here. It's not going to be a problem. We're going to cut that away. Okay, so after you've got a bunch of the wedge shapes that you want to quilt, that you want to work with, we're going to start sewing them together in pairs. And just like when we were cutting, we're going to focus on the wide edge first. So I'm going to take my two pieces and make sure that the wide edge is nice and lined up. And again, there might be a little variability down here at the narrow end, no problem. And then I'll take that over to the sewing machine and stitch it together following the 1/4 inch seam. Now, the only thing you have to pay attention to, really, you're working with two bias pieces here. If they're really long wedge shapes that you're working with, you might want to pin them together. With shorter wedge shapes like this, I don't think you need to, but that's all up to you and how much precision you need out of your patchwork. As you get down to the narrow end, you'll just want to make sure that your work isn't sliding away from you. And if you like to use a stiletto for tiny pieces, you can do that. I usually just keep my finger on it until I know we've got it under the foot. And then you'll have a little pair. And once you have 3 pairs sewn together, that's where you'll stop. And you'll have a wedge set like this. So here you've got 6 10-degree wedges. So if you add 10 together 6 times, you've got a 60-degree piece, a 60-degree portion of a circle. We want to check to make sure everything lines up right when we go to put the final block together. We're going to check that this is 60 degrees before we go any further. If you have a cutting mat that has a 60-degree mark on it, you can use that, and let me show you how. We use, so I know that this line is 60 degrees along with any of these horizontal lines. That makes a 60-degree angle. So I'm using this angle of 60 degrees and bringing it down here to line up with this horizontal line. And I'm just checking, wiggling it around until I can get a good feel for whether my piece is a true 60 degrees. And what I see here is that somewhere along the process, I got a little tight on the narrow end. And that's okay. Really, I sewed 5 seams together here, and even a little tiny mistake, if you multiply it 5 times, can add up to something. So it's better to deal with it now than to have blocks that don't fit right later. So I'm going to make it so that I can trim that part off. This little excess of the wide angle off. So I've lined up my block there. And now I just use the line of the cutting mat to guide the cut. So that's just a little bit coming off there, and I'll leave that lined up. Oops, I am moving this one all around, but it's gonna be fine. And then I'll do the same thing over here. Lined up with the 60-degree mark. Oh, and that little thing slid right away from me. Okay, so once you have your piece at a true 60-degree angle, now it's time to turn it into a triangle. And triangles do not have curves, so first thing we got to do is cut off these curves. How we'll do that is to line up the points on the wide end of the curve and just chop that whole thing off from point to point. And then you'll use your fabric ruler to measure. Let's see. This is going to say there's an extra ½ inch on this ruler, so it's a little different from the ruler I use at home. I'm going to use this center line on the ruler and line it up with the center seam on my wedge set so that I know I'm getting a nice perpendicular cut. And I'm going to make sure that the distance between the first cut I made and the second cut I made is 7¼ inches. But you can do this technique with any size wedges. So you can just, as long as you're doing it consistently from one block to the next, this technique will work for you. All right. So then we've got this, it's almost a triangle. We just need to fill in this little point. So we'll take a square of fabric and lay it down there, centered so that you have a little bit of raw fabric on either end, and stitch those together. And what you'll have is this. And now because you know this thing is 60 degrees, you get to just use the edges that you already used, that you already squared up to 60 degrees. To finish out the triangle. And that's your finished block. Now once you have a ton of these, you have the fun of rearranging them and rearranging them and rearranging them. You can use them just as the triangles that they are. And if you do, you could do something like this, alternating points up and points down in long strips. But you can also start putting them together into bigger blocks. So here I've got a lantern-shaped block, and that gives you an arrangement kind of like that. Or you can use this, this arrangement kind of looks like an eye to me, and it gives me that sort of arrangement when I put it together. I love that one. And of course, the natural thing to do with a bunch of triangles is to arrange them into a hexagon like this one. And that's really fun. If you are putting hexagons together and you have whole hexagons, you're going to end up putting together some Y seams, and that should actually work out just fine. But if you don't want to deal with Y seams, then go ahead and stop at the half hexagon stage when you're putting your blocks together. So 3 of the blocks together, and then keep the other half hexagon separate, and then you can join them like that into long strips when you're completing your piece. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the magical triangle block.